The confirmation hearing for Pete Hegseth quickly escalated from procedural questioning to an intense moral and professional examination the moment Senator Tim Kaine turned the focus to Hegseth's personal life. While confirmation hearings often probe nominees on policy, experience, and qualifications, this particular exchange transcended the typical format. It highlighted the central principle that a nominee's past personal decisions are not isolated matters. They directly inform their judgment, reliability, and suitability to hold one of the highest offices in the country. The incident in Monterey, California, in October 2017, became the cornerstone of this line of questioning, forcing Hegseth to confront not just allegations, but the broader implications of his actions. Kaine began by establishing the timeline of Hegseth's personal relationships, noting that at the time of the Monterey incident, Hegseth was married to his second wife, while having recently fathered a child with a woman who would later become his third wife. This juxtaposition was deliberate. Kaine's questioning sought to illustrate that Hegseth's personal decisions were not private indiscretions, but complex choices with immediate moral and ethical consequences. Hegseth responded by asserting that he was falsely charged and had been completely investigated and cleared, emphasizing the legal resolution of the matter. Yet Kaine's follow-up was incisive. He challenged the very definition of being cleared, distinguishing between legal exoneration and moral responsibility. The core of Kaine's approach was to frame the discussion around judgment, asking whether someone could casually engage in extramarital sexual activity while still claiming to be fully cleared in terms of ethical accountability. The questioning then turned to the specific acts themselves. Hegseth acknowledged consensual sexual activity at the hotel in October 2017, an acknowledgement that Kaine used to explore the broader implications of fidelity, honesty, and judgment. By highlighting that this act occurred shortly after Hegseth fathered a child with another woman, Kaine emphasized the stakes involved. Hegseth was not merely making private mistakes, but was making choices that had real consequences for his family, public image, and potentially the office he sought to hold. The line of questioning was structured to elicit clarity on Hegseth's ability to recognize the gravity of his actions, an ability fundamental for a nominee responsible for national security and the lives of millions. Kaine's strategy extended beyond the personal dimension into the legal and procedural aspects of Hegseth's past. He raised the topic of the criminal charge, investigation, and settlement associated with the Monterey incident. Hegseth described the settlement as a confidential resolution of a nuisance lawsuit, framing it as an innocuous administrative matter. Kaine, however, pressed on the rationale behind the settlement, highlighting statements Hegseth had made in interviews that suggested the resolution was motivated by a desire to protect his career rather than out of necessity. This questioning struck at the heart of Hegseth's judgment. A nominee who prioritizes personal preservation over transparency risks compromising trust at the highest levels of government. An important element in this segment was a discussion around non-disclosure agreements. Kaine methodically explored whether prior divorces involved confidentiality clauses, and whether Hegseth would release his former spouses from any such agreements. Hegseth's responses revealed a recurring theme of deflection. He either claimed unawareness or suggested it was not his responsibility. Through this line of questioning, Kaine highlighted a critical aspect of leadership for the Department of Defense: the ability to take ownership, confront difficult truths, and prioritize institutional responsibility over personal convenience. These qualities, Kaine implicitly argued, were non-negotiable for anyone entrusted with national defense authority. The exchange also touched on broader ethical principles, such as physical violence against spouses, workplace behavior, and the implications of personal misconduct for public office. By framing questions and hypotheticals, asking if acts such as domestic violence, sexual assault, or intoxication on duty will be disqualifying, Kaine aimed to probe Hegseth's moral reasoning in abstract terms. The repeated evasion of these hypotheticals was telling. It revealed an inability or unwillingness to articulate clear standards for acceptable behavior, a deficiency that transcends the specifics of the Monterey incident. In this way, the hearing made clear that Hegseth's personal conduct and his approach to accountability were inextricably linked to his capacity to exercise sound judgment in office. Kaine's questioning style in this segment was meticulous yet unadorned. He did not sensationalize the allegations or resort to emotional appeals. Instead, he systematically laid out a series of verifiable events, statements, and admissions, allowing Hegseth's own words and actions to illustrate patterns of behavior. This methodical approach underscored the principle that leadership in national security relies not merely on competence, but on credibility, moral clarity, and transparency. By holding Hegseth accountable to both the legal and ethical dimensions of his past, Kaine demonstrated how personal history directly informs public responsibility, particularly in positions where the consequences of poor judgment are immeasurably high. Finally, the first segment of this hearing emphasized a critical philosophical divide. One perspective, represented by Kaine, treats accountability as a cornerstone of leadership, where errors must be acknowledged and transparently addressed. The opposing perspective, reflected in Hegseth's responses, prioritized narrative control and personal reputation management. This divergence illuminated the stakes involved in high-level appointments. The Secretary of Defense cannot operate in a culture of selective transparency. Trust and reliability are foundational to the role, and a demonstrated pattern of concealment or deflection calls into question a nominee's ability to safeguard national security. In conclusion, Segment 1 of the Hegseth confirmation hearing establishes the framework for understanding the tension between personal conduct, accountability, and suitability for public office. The Monterey incident serves as more than a historical footnote. It becomes a lens through which Kaine examines judgment, moral clarity, and the willingness to confront inconvenient truths. The meticulous unpacking of Hegseth's actions and responses not only illuminates the nominee's character, but also sets a precedent for evaluating how personal decisions translate into professional reliability, particularly in roles of extraordinary national and global responsibility. By the end of this segment, the audience is left with a clear impression. Personal failures are forgivable, but the choice to conceal them or to prioritize self-interest over transparency poses a significant risk when entrusted with the defense of the nation. Following the deep dive into Pete Hegseth's personal conduct in the Monterey incident, Senator Tim Kaine shifted the focus toward Hegseth's professional judgment and behavior in various work environments. This transition was deliberate. While personal failings can illustrate ethical decision-making, the professional realm reveals how those choices manifest in leadership, culture, and accountability. Hegseth's career spanned nonprofit leadership, media commentary, and veteran advocacy, providing multiple lenses through which Kaine could evaluate his conduct. By examining these settings, the senator aimed to determine whether Hegseth's behavior exhibited patterns that might compromise his ability to lead the Department of Defense, an institution that demands the highest ethical standards. Kaine's questioning began with Hegseth's tenure in nonprofit organizations, specifically leadership roles in veterans advocacy groups. The senator asked whether Hegseth had ever been fired or terminated from these positions. Hegseth's responses emphasized continuity in his employment and denied any formal termination. However, Kaine's line of inquiry went further, exploring whether Hegseth's professional relationships had been governed by non-disclosure agreements, contracts, or other legal instruments that could limit transparency. Again, Hegseth either claimed unawareness or shifted responsibility, demonstrating a pattern of deflection that Kaine subtly highlighted as a concern for someone vying for a position requiring absolute trust. The examination then turned to workplace behavior, including allegations of intoxication, inappropriate conduct, and sexual harassment. Kaine raised specific examples from records and testimonies, highlighting incidents where colleagues claimed Hegseth appeared under the influence during professional events, chanted offensive slogans, or engaged in inappropriate interactions with staff and external parties. Hegseth responded by labeling these allegations as anonymous or false. Yet the senator pointed out that many of these accounts were well documented, with names and evidence attached. This juxtaposition was crucial. It emphasized that professional misconduct cannot be dismissed merely by questioning the credibility of sources. The recurring patterns across different contexts, nonprofits, media engagements, and advocacy groups, painted a broader picture of a leadership style that could tolerate or minimize problematic behavior. Kaine's method was methodical and layered. He did not rely on rhetorical flourish, but constructed a chain of reasoning linking Hegseth's decisions, accountability, and professional impact. By asking whether intoxication, harassment, or unethical conduct would be disqualifying for a Secretary of Defense, Kaine probed Hegseth's ability to establish moral boundaries. Hegseth repeatedly deflected, refused to define clear standards, or limited his answers to his personal conduct. This reluctance revealed a philosophical gap. The nominee could not articulate general principles of accountability even when prompted hypothetically, raising concerns about a capacity to uphold organizational discipline and ethical norms in a department overseeing global military operations. Another critical element in this segment was a discussion of settlement agreements, confidentiality clauses, and the selective disclosure of past incidents. Kaine repeatedly asked whether Hegseth had disclosed all relevant facts to the presidential transition team or to the administration considering his nomination. Hegseth's answers indicated that he had not, rationalizing omissions as being tied to legal obligations or confidentiality constraints. While these explanations may have been legally defensible, Kaine highlighted the ethical implications. In a role where transparency up the chain of command is essential, concealing critical information, even for personal protection, signals a willingness to gamble with trust. In essence, Hegseth's approach treated disclosure as optional rather than mandatory, a perspective Kaine underscored as incompatible with leadership at the Pentagon. Kaine also explored the implications of workplace culture under Hegseth's leadership. The senator referenced reports of staff discomfort, allegations of harassment, and interactions that suggested an environment in which boundaries were blurred, professional standards were inconsistently applied, and accountability could be circumvented. By documenting patterns of behavior rather than isolated incidents, Kaine framed a critical question. What does it mean for national security leadership when a nominee has repeatedly demonstrated a tendency to minimize misconduct, dismiss complaints, or protect personal reputation over institutional integrity? This strategic line of questioning reinforced a link between ethical behavior, workplace culture, and readiness for one of the most consequential offices in the U.S. government. A significant dimension of this segment was Kaine's focus on moral reasoning under hypothetical scenarios. By repeatedly asking whether sexual assault, domestic violence, or workplace misconduct would disqualify someone from leading the Department of Defense, Kaine placed Hegseth in a position where evasion was revealing. Each refusal to articulate a clear standard exposed a gap in judgment and moral clarity. In high-stakes leadership roles, the ability to distinguish right from wrong in abstract terms is critical because decisions must be made rapidly, often without complete information. The pattern of deflection demonstrated a tendency to prioritize personal narrative management over ethical clarity, raising red flags about decision-making under pressure. Kaine's approach in this segment also underscored the interplay between professional and personal accountability. While Hegseth could frame certain issues as resolved, confidential, or false claims, Kaine consistently tied these narratives back to leadership responsibility. A leader's past behavior, particularly repeated patterns of ethical lapses or evasions, is an indicator of future conduct. The senator's line of questioning illuminated a fundamental principle. Accountability in leadership is not only about adherence to the law, but also about fostering an environment where transparency, integrity, and ethical standards are non-negotiable. Finally, Segment 2 concluded by illustrating a philosophical tension at the heart of the hearing. Hegseth's repeated evasions and selective disclosures revealed a worldview that treated accountability as conditional, dependent on personal convenience or legal boundaries. Kaine's interrogation, conversely, treated accountability as absolute, a prerequisite for leadership. By drawing attention to the consistent patterns across personal life, nonprofit management, and professional conduct, the segment highlighted why past behavior, both admitted and documented, matters profoundly when evaluating a candidate for national security leadership. The audience is left with a clear takeaway. Professional judgment and workplace conduct are not peripheral to national defense. They are essential indicators of whether a nominee can be trusted with the immense responsibilities of the Secretary of Defense. To one of the most consequential aspects of Pete Hegseth's nomination, transparency and the deliberate omissions in his disclosures to the presidential transition team. While much of the earlier questioning focused on personal conduct and professional behavior, this segment underscored a principle that is non-negotiable in national security leadership. Trust depends on full disclosure. The ability to make decisions at the highest levels of government requires absolute confidence that leaders are forthcoming about both past actions and ongoing risks. Any deliberate concealment can have repercussions that extend far beyond individual reputations. It can compromise the effectiveness of national security decision-making, jeopardize the lives of service members, and undermine confidence in the U.S. government domestically and internationally. Kaine's questioning methodically explored the Monterey incident, including the criminal investigation, the private settlement cash payments, and non-disclosure agreements. He asked why Hegseth had not revealed any of these elements to President Trump or the transition team, emphasizing that these were not minor details, but significant events directly relevant to evaluating a candidate for Secretary of Defense. Hegseth's responses attempted to frame the matters as either false claims or legally constrained by confidentiality. However, Kaine repeatedly cut through these rationalizations, illustrating that leadership at the Pentagon does not operate in a vacuum of legal absolutes. It relies on moral and professional judgment to assess risks and integrity. By choosing to omit critical information, even for personal protection, a nominee signals a willingness to prioritize self-interest over institutional responsibility, a pattern Kaine highlighted as fundamentally disqualifying for someone responsible for the nation's defense. The senator also probed Hegseth's reasoning behind settling certain disputes, particularly the private settlements related to the Monterey incident and other workplace allegations. Hegseth had previously claimed that settlements were intended to avoid public scrutiny and protect his career. Kaine framed this choice as a deliberate trade-off. The nominee prioritized personal reputation management over transparent disclosure to those responsible for assessing his fitness for office. This distinction is essential because the Department of Defense is a trust-based institution where undisclosed vulnerabilities, legal liabilities, or past misconduct could directly impact operational decisions, strategic communications, or the chain of command. By not proactively revealing these facts, Hegseth demonstrated a willingness to withhold information that others might consider essential to national security evaluation. The questioning further explored the implications of non-disclosure agreements in Hegseth's personal and professional life. Kaine asked whether previous spouses, colleagues, or associates had been bound by confidentiality clauses that limited what they could disclose about his behavior. Hegseth either professed unawareness or suggested that releasing these parties from confidentiality was not his responsibility. This evasiveness drew attention to a critical leadership question. If a nominee cannot navigate, acknowledge, or proactively resolve confidentiality constraints in a manner that supports transparency, how can they be expected to foster an environment of trust and accountability in the Pentagon? Leadership in national defense requires both procedural competence and moral clarity. These exchanges suggested that Hegseth struggled with the latter. Kaine's line of questioning highlighted the tension between legal resolution and ethical responsibility. Hegseth repeatedly emphasized that certain charges were false or resolved, yet Kaine pushed to distinguish between being legally cleared and being morally accountable. Transparency in government leadership is not merely a matter of legality. It is an ethical obligation. When critical information is withheld during the vetting process, it places the President, Congress, and the nation at risk of relying on incomplete or inaccurate representations. By failing to disclose past incidents, even those Hegseth deemed legally irrelevant, he revealed a philosophical stance that treats disclosure as optional rather than necessary, undermining confidence in his judgment and reliability. Another crucial aspect of this segment was Kaine's repeated return to the question of whether there were any other important facts Hegseth chose not to reveal. Though deceptively simple, the question struck at the core of accountability. A nominee who has fully addressed past incidents would have answered with certainty and transparency. Instead, Hegseth hesitated, deflected, and emphasized the constraints imposed by NDAs or confidentiality agreements. This hesitation was revealing. It demonstrated an instinct to protect one's image and minimize the perceived consequences of past behavior, rather than proactively embrace full transparency. For the audience and for the committee, this moment crystallized a fundamental concern. Concealment, even in the absence of criminal culpability, erodes trust, and trust is a bedrock upon which national security leadership rests. Kaine also emphasized the cumulative effect of repeated omissions. It was not a single incident or a solitary failure to disclose that raised concern, but a pattern. Personal indiscretions, settlements, workplace allegations, and NDAs, each on its own might have been manageable, but together they represented a consistent approach to managing narrative rather than confronting truth. In leadership, patterns matter as much as isolated acts. By repeatedly prioritizing confidentiality, personal reputation, or legal shielding over forthright disclosure, Hegseth demonstrated a decision-making framework that prioritizes self-interest, a framework Kaine argued is incompatible with the responsibilities of the Secretary of Defense. This segment also addressed the broader philosophical implications for public office. Kaine's questions highlighted a critical distinction between human imperfection and ethical accountability. All individuals make mistakes, both personal and professional. Yet, for those entrusted with high office, there is a non-negotiable expectation. Errors must be disclosed, confronted, and addressed. The willingness to conceal or manage information strategically for personal advantage demonstrates a worldview in which accountability is optional, contingent on convenience. In a role where trust, transparency, and judgment are inseparable from operational effectiveness, this worldview is deeply concerning. Finally, Segment 3 concluded by connecting transparency to national security itself. A Secretary of Defense must be able to provide accurate, complete information to the President, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and other senior officials, even when it reflects poorly on personal decisions. Any history of concealment raises legitimate questions about how that individual would handle sensitive operational decisions, potential conflicts, or crises. Kaine's interrogation revealed that Hegseth's approach to disclosure, shaped by personal priorities and narrative management, was inconsistent with the standard expected for one of the most consequential positions in government. By systematically documenting omissions, rationalizations, and evasions, this segment made clear that transparency is not optional in national defense leadership. It is foundational. As the hearing unfolded, Senator Tim Kaine shifted the focus to a broader analysis of Pete Hegseth's behavior across multiple professional environments. The purpose of this line of questioning was not to sensationalize isolated incidents, but to reveal patterns that illuminate the kind of leadership culture a nominee brings to the Department of Defense. In positions of high responsibility, particularly in national security, the consistency of one's behavior across contexts matters as much as individual missteps. By examining Hegseth's conduct in nonprofit organizations, media appearances, and advocacy roles, Kaine was able to assess whether the behaviors previously discussed were anomalies or part of a persistent approach to authority, accountability, and interpersonal conduct. Kaine began by addressing Hegseth's nonprofit leadership roles, where he served as CEO and executive director. Multiple colleagues from these organizations reported that Hegseth displayed conduct inconsistent with professional norms, including attending work events under the influence of alcohol and engaging in inappropriate interactions with staff. These allegations, while disputed by Hegseth as false or anonymous, were documented in letters, internal records, and witness accounts. Kaine's strategy was to highlight that these were not isolated complaints, but part of a recurring pattern of behavior in different professional settings. The consistency of these reports raised questions about the environment Hegseth created as a leader. Did it foster accountability, or did it tolerate misconduct and boundary violations? The senator also probed Hegseth's behavior in public-facing roles, such as his time as a media contributor and public advocate for veterans. During these engagements, colleagues reported incidents where Hegseth allegedly engaged in inappropriate or unprofessional conduct, including attending bars while intoxicated and participating in events with questionable interactions with others. Hegseth's responses often emphasized denials or claims that these were isolated events. However, Kaine pressed on the cumulative significance of these behaviors, framing them as evidence of decision-making patterns and judgment tendencies. In leadership, repeated lapses in judgment, even if individually minor, can signal deeper issues with impulse control, ethical reasoning, and respect for institutional standards. A particularly notable aspect of this segment was Kaine's focus on the intersection of personal misconduct and organizational culture. He drew connections between Hegseth's personal choices and the work environments he led, highlighting how leaders set the tone for acceptable behavior. Multiple colleagues consistently described a work culture where rules were flexible, misconduct could be minimized, and personal reputation was often prioritized over accountability. By establishing these recurring patterns, Kaine illustrated that Hegseth's actions were not confined to private indiscretions, but extended into professional environments where the stakes included not just employee welfare, but organizational credibility, mission effectiveness, and ethical standards. Kaine's questions also emphasized the reputational risk associated with repeated misconduct. In roles overseeing sensitive operations, any behavior that erodes confidence among colleagues, staff, or the public can have cascading effects. For the Department of Defense, which relies on clear hierarchies, operational discipline, and trust at every level, the ability of a leader to maintain professional integrity is non-negotiable. Hegseth's repeated evasion, Selective acknowledgement and tendency to dismiss criticism suggested a leadership approach that prioritized self-interest and image management over cultivating a culture of responsibility and accountability. The hearing further explored specific allegations from workplace settings. Colleagues reported instances where Hegseth's conduct, including intoxication or inappropriate interactions, directly affected other staff, sometimes resulting in formal complaints or sexual harassment claims. Kaine meticulously documented these accounts, emphasizing that these were not rumors but verified reports with tangible consequences for the organizations involved. By connecting these incidents across different environments, Kaine painted a picture of a nominee whose leadership style may tolerate or inadvertently encourage risky, unethical, or unprofessional behavior. Another critical point in this segment was Kaine's methodical distinction between denial and accountability. Hegseth repeatedly denied allegations, labeling them as false or anonymous, yet could not fully contextualize consistent patterns reported by multiple witnesses. This distinction matters because leadership is defined not only by what one says about oneself, but by the environment one creates for others. If multiple independent reports describe the same behaviors, it reflects on the leader's ability to set standards, enforce norms, and foster professional culture. The inability to recognize or address these patterns suggested a gap in judgment that extends beyond isolated personal failings. Kaine also explored how these patterns might influence decision-making at the Pentagon. Leadership in defense requires a capacity to assess risks, enforce standards, and maintain operational integrity, even under pressure. A leader accustomed to deflecting accountability, minimizing criticism, or prioritizing personal interests over organizational needs may struggle to uphold these principles. By framing the discussion around repeated behaviors, Kaine highlighted the relevance of professional patterns to high-stakes national security roles, illustrating that personal judgment and ethical conduct in everyday settings are predictors of broader decision-making capabilities. Finally, Segment 4 concluded by tying patterns of misconduct to broader ethical and operational implications. The senator's line of questioning made clear that leadership culture is not an abstract concept. It shapes how teams operate, how risks are managed, and how ethical standards are enforced. Hegseth's repeated evasions, denials, and documented behavior across multiple environments suggested a leadership approach that may lack transparency, consistency, and accountability, qualities essential for overseeing one of the most consequential government departments. By documenting these patterns, this segment reinforced a central theme. The suitability of a nominee for Secretary of Defense cannot be assessed solely by qualifications or isolated incidents. It must also be measured by patterns of conduct that reveal character, judgment, and the capacity to uphold the ethical standards necessary for national security leadership. One of the most revealing aspects of Senator Tim Kaine's questioning in the Hegseth confirmation hearing was his deliberate focus on moral reasoning and ethical boundaries. Rather than dwelling solely on documented past behavior, Kaine sought to understand how Hegseth conceptualized accountability, judgment, and disqualifying actions in the abstract. By framing hypotheticals around sexual assault, domestic violence, intoxication on the job, and unethical conduct, Kaine pressed Hegseth to articulate a clear framework for evaluating the fitness of a leader. This line of questioning was designed not to trap the nominee with legal minutiae, but to reveal his philosophical approach to ethics and whether he could apply consistent standards beyond his personal circumstances. The hypotheticals were particularly powerful because they exposed the tension between Hegseth's personal narrative and universal ethical principles. For instance, when asked whether acts of sexual assault or domestic violence should be disqualifying for a Secretary of Defense, Hegseth repeatedly deflected, insisting that the questions were hypothetical and referring only to his own past experience. Kaine's insistence on abstract reasoning highlighted a crucial deficiency. A leader responsible for national security cannot selectively apply moral standards. The inability to establish a generalizable, principled approach to misconduct signals a worldview in which accountability is contingent on circumstance, personal interest, or legal resolution. In the context of the Pentagon, this raises concerns about the capacity to make fair, consistent decisions under pressure. Kaine also connected these ethical hypotheticals directly to documented patterns in Hegseth's behavior. By juxtaposing past allegations with questions about disqualifying conduct, he highlighted a consistency between actions and moral reasoning. Hegseth's reluctance to acknowledge universally unacceptable behavior, even hypothetically, suggested a philosophical gap. He was unable or unwilling to articulate boundaries that extend beyond his own legal and personal considerations. For a nominee seeking to oversee the most powerful military apparatus in the world, this inability to define ethical limits is more than an academic concern. It is indicative of potential lapses in judgment when evaluating crises, personnel, or sensitive operational decisions. Another critical dimension was Kaine's focus on accountability versus legal resolution. Hegseth repeatedly framed incidents as false claims or legally resolved matters, implying that resolution absolved moral responsibility. Kaine challenged this framework by emphasizing that ethical accountability is not identical to legal exoneration. Even in cases where claims are legally dismissed, leaders have an obligation to recognize the broader implications of their actions. The Senate's scrutiny in this context was less about punitive judgment and more about evaluating whether Hegseth could internalize lessons from past conduct, apply consistent moral reasoning, and make principled decisions when consequences extend beyond personal interest. Kaine's hypotheticals also probed Hegseth's ability to prioritize institutional standards over personal protection. For example, the senator asked whether failure to disclose critical facts or misrepresentations would disqualify someone from leadership. Hegseth's responses often attempted to confine the discussion to his own experience, avoiding a generalized principle. This approach illustrated a fundamental limitation. While Hegseth sought to manage his narrative, he could not articulate an ethical framework that would guide decisions independently of personal consequences. For the Department of Defense, where leaders must weigh sensitive intelligence, operational risks, and ethical obligations simultaneously, this philosophical gap is deeply concerning. Furthermore, Kaine's approach underscored the relationship between moral reasoning and organizational culture. Leaders who fail to define or enforce ethical boundaries create environments in which misconduct can proliferate. The hypotheticals serve as a lens to evaluate how Hegseth might respond to ethical dilemmas in operational contexts, decisions that could affect the lives of service members, international relations, or the use of military force. By examining Hegseth's responses, the hearing exposed not only gaps in personal judgment, but also potential weaknesses in cultivating a culture of integrity, accountability, and professionalism at the Pentagon. This segment also revealed the distinction between personal imperfection and professional responsibility. Kaine acknowledged that all individuals are fallible and that mistakes do not automatically preclude leadership. However, he stressed that leaders must be able to confront inconvenient truths, apply ethical reasoning consistently, and recognize disqualifying behavior, even when it is abstract or hypothetical. Hegseth's repeated evasion suggested a worldview in which ethical standards are negotiable, contingent, or primarily self-referential, a perspective incompatible with the accountability and transparency required as Secretary of Defense. The hypotheticals were further used to highlight patterns of concealment. Kaine emphasized that leadership in national security requires more than reactive transparency. It demands proactive disclosure and principled decision-making. The inability to articulate clear ethical boundaries, combined with history of selectively managing information, suggested a leadership philosophy in which narrative control supersedes institutional responsibility. For the Senate and the public, this was a critical insight. Moral reasoning in hypotheticals is not a theoretical exercise. It is predictive of how a leader will navigate ethical, operational, and strategic decisions under pressure. Finally, Segment 5 concluded by underscoring a central theme: the importance of philosophical clarity in evaluating leaders. Kaine's hypotheticals were not intended to condemn Hegseth's personal history, but to illuminate whether he possessed a moral framework to lead effectively, enforce accountability, and foster a culture of integrity. The repeated evasions and lack of principled reasoning revealed a gap that cannot be remedied by legal clearance or technical qualifications alone. For the Department of Defense, where decisions carry global consequences, this gap in ethical reasoning and moral clarity is deeply consequential, demonstrating that character, judgment, and accountability are inseparable from operational competence.